Top 7 Chilling Facts About King Henry VI's Illness. The long-awaited heir to the throne had just been born. Bathed in the flickering candlelight of the royal chamber, the infant was held aloft before the most powerful man in Europe. The king glanced at the child for exactly 1 second, and then his head dropped. His gaze fell to the floor in a heavy, suffocating silence. He was as still as a corpse, as hollow as an abandoned cathedral. The horrifying truth was that for the past 18 months, this king had not fed himself. He had not used the latrine of his own volition. He had not uttered a single syllable. His flesh still drew breath, but his mind had entirely evaporated. In a desperate, barbaric attempt to summon his soul back from the abyss, the royal physicians had pinned him down, shaved his head bald, and rubbed his scalp with blistering mustard. They filled his room with the acrid stench of rotting herbal smoke and subjected him to the agony of daily rectal enemas. It was all in vain. How did a once promising sovereign transform into a statue of flesh upon the English throne? By the end of this video, you will uncover the darkest truths surrounding Henry VI, the ravaging onslaught of catatonic schizophrenia that froze his brain, the 400-year-old secret of his shattered skull hidden beneath a royal veil, and the insane reason why a mindless, broken king was nearly canonized as a saint by the Vatican. Hit that like and subscribe button now. Let us step into the dimmest corridors of the British monarchy. Truth number 1. The Saint of the Sinners, the Post-Mortem Miracles. Let me take you back to England on a biting winter afternoon in 1471. A thick, suffocating fog crawls up from the River Thames, swallowing Chertsey Abbey, a remote, damp sanctuary carved from ancient stone. The wind whistles through the mossy crevices, carrying the gut-wrenching wails of a peasant woman in rags. Her bare feet are bloodied, having carried her across miles of treacherous mud and slush. Clutched against her sobbing chest is the cold, blue, lifeless body of a 3-year-old boy. He had been pulled from the bottom of a deep pond. He had stopped breathing long ago. In that era, any plague doctor or village priest would have told her to build a small wooden casket and pray for the boy's soul. But this mother was beyond reason. She didn't seek a doctor. She crashed through the abbey doors, charging toward a crude, impoverished stone tomb tucked away in a shadowed corner. She collapsed, her bleeding fingernails clawing at the cold slab as she shrieked the name of the former king who had been brutally assassinated only a short time prior. Lord King Henry, have mercy. Bring back the soul of my son. The monks standing by could only shake their heads in pity for a mind snapped by grief. But then, amidst the deathly silence of the abbey, a sound emerged that made the hair on their necks stand up. A violent, wet cough, a spray of murky water and pond silt. The child in the mother's arms suddenly convulsed, his tiny chest heaving with the first gasps of life, and his eyes fluttered open. The drowned boy had returned from the dead. This was no folklore spun by drunks in a seaside tavern. This was a documented event, recorded with clinical gravity in Latin within the sheepskin ledgers of the Royal Church. The supreme irony of history lies here. Henry VI, a king who in life was considered the shame of England, a chronic mental patient who spent his days muttering prayers and smiling vacantly, became a religious phenomenon of explosive proportions after his death. From that humble grave at Chertsey, and later his grander tomb at Windsor Castle, the English people swarmed like a great migration. This wave of pilgrims was not composed of silk-clad nobility. They were the dregs of society. the crippled dragging themselves on rotting wooden crutches, the blind led by the hands of children, and those carrying the stench of incurable diseases that medieval medicine could not touch. They didn't come to mourn a fallen monarch, they came for a miracle. And here is the fact that makes even modern medical science squint in disbelief. History records that miracles did happen, not once, but hundreds of times. According to official records scrutinized by the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2020 and reinforced by historian Lauren Johnson in her seminal work Shadow King, 2019, there were a total of 174 proven miracles. Verification in those days required eyewitnesses, physical evidence, and the corroboration of high-ranking clergy. The ledgers describe chilling cases: a blind man who suddenly saw the sun after touching a wooden effigy of Henry, a young man whose body was crushed by a grain mill, only to stand up and walk as if nothing had happened after being touched by a scrap of the king's old tunic. And most ironically, a massive portion of those seeking his grave were mental patients. Those tormented by paranoid delusions, those locked in iron cages by a society that viewed them as demon-possessed, suddenly found a terrifying clarity and peace within their minds after praying to the Mad King. Was it a divine resonance between broken souls? Ow! The pressure from this cult-like devotion was so immense that the Tudor dynasty, the victors of the Civil War, realized they were sitting on a PR goldmine. King Henry VII launched a massive political marketing campaign. He had all 174 miracle dossiers bound in red velvet and sent his most eloquent envoys across the sea directly to the Vatican. His goal? To have the Pope officially canonize Henry VI as a saint. And do you know what the craziest part is? The Vatican actually believed it. The cardinals opened a rigorous investigation, dissecting every miracle. They were a single signature away from entering this schizophrenic king into the pantheon of the Catholic Church's greatest saints. But if it weren't for Henry VIII's later temper tantrum and break from Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, we might today have Saint Henry, patron of the insane. But this leaves us with a shivering question. How could a man capable of such earth-shattering post-mortem wonders have ended his life in such utter, silent, and lonely misery? What truly happened in the shadows of the Tower of London? Truth number 2. The murder in the Tower, the cruel lies of the official record. How does a potential living saint end his days in a damp cell, followed by a lie so brazen it was pasted on every church door in the kingdom? To find the answer, we must dive into the filthiest political maneuver of the 15th century. The Tower of London was no vacation palace. It was a notorious spirit-crushing machine. The smell of the tower was a nauseating cocktail, the stench of damp moss rising from the sewage-filled Thames, the metallic tang of rusted iron bars, and the thick, suffocating aroma of despair etched into the very stones. In a cramped cell in the Wakefield Tower, illuminated by the guttering flame of a tallow candle, sat Henry VI. He looked like a threat to no one. His body was withered, like a dried-out husk. His silver-streaked hair hung in matted clumps over a gaunt, hollow face. His vacant, unfocused eyes stared into the void, his lips moving in a rhythmic, subconscious recitation of Latin scripture. Since being stripped of his crown and thrown into this cage, his world had shrunk to a prayer book and a stone wall. He didn't care for power. He didn't crave revenge. His mind had retreated into a dark, quiet sanctuary to escape the horror of reality. The next morning, May 22nd, London woke to the sharp blast of brass trumpets and royal proclamations being nailed to every square. The new regime of King Edward IV officially announced the former king, Henry VI, passed away last night. The cause of death was written in elegant, flowing black ink. His Majesty succumbed to melancholia, an unendurable sorrow. The news of his only son's death on the battlefield broke his heart, and he withered away naturally and purely. A beautiful story, isn't it? A humanistic tragedy of a frail father dying of grief. The Yorkist spin doctors must have patted themselves on the back for such a romantic and plausible lie. But beneath the muddy streets of London, in the smoke-filled taverns and the dark corners of the court, no one, absolutely no one, believed this cheap fairy tale. Smirks and whispers spread like a plague. If you stepped back and looked at the political chessboard, the truth emerged like a demon from the fog. Let's look at the motive. On the very day Henry died of sadness, Edward IV had just secured a devastating victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Lancaster army, Henry's supporters, had been slaughtered. The greatest threat, Henry's young son and heir, had been brutally cut down on the battlefield weeks prior. The Yorks were on the verge of total control. But there was one small splinter remaining under Edward IV's velvet cushion, the steady heartbeat of Henry VI in the Tower. To a cold-blooded monarch like Edward IV, a mad old man wasn't scary, but the symbol of that man was lethal. As long as Henry VI drew breath, every rebel and disgruntled lord had a legitimate flag to rally behind. Henry VI was the final piece that had to be erased for the House of York to sleep soundly. Most modern historians, from Bertram Wolfe in his massive biography Henry VI, 1981, to Lauren Johnson, have unceremoniously debunked this historical lie. They arrive at a gruesome but undeniable verdict. Henry VI did not die of melancholy. He was assassinated on the direct orders of Edward IV, a political execution carried out in the dead of night. A king who spent his life tormented by mental illness, who never lusted for power, who abhorred violence and blood, was silenced in a dusty corner simply because his existence annoyed the ambitious. So, on that silent night of May 21st, how did they do it? The Yorkist chronicles carefully hid the weapon and the method, but crime always leaves a trail. There is a piece of evidence sharper than any lie, harder than any proclamation, and more patient than any dynasty. The bones. Truth number 3. The shattered skull. The silent scream. The perpetrators of history always want to bury the evidence deep, under layers of dirt, under flowery lies, and under the weight of power. Edward IV did exactly that, and he dumped Henry's cold body into a vault, labeled it grief, and assumed time would erode all suspicion. But they forgot a ruthless law of forensics. Words may lie, but bones do not. In 1910, inside the magnificent grounds of Windsor Castle, a group of top archaeologists and historians, under special permission from King George V, did the unthinkable. They exhumed the tomb of Henry VI to find the final truth. The air in the chapel was thick with tension. The sound of steel crowbars grinding against the massive marble slab echoed like bone on bone. As the heavy lid slid aside, a gust of ancient air, a chilling mix of dust, mold, and rotted shroud, hit the researchers. Flashlights cut through the darkness of the pit. What they saw made even the most hardened scholars flinch. Oh. There, in a half-decomposed oak box, lay the skeleton. It was not the peaceful remains of a man who died of psychological distress. On the contrary, the skull of Henry VI was screaming a bloody truth. A massive section of the back of the skull had been pulverized, Sharp shards of bone were driven inward into the brain cavity. But what haunted the archaeologists most, what cost them sleep for weeks, was what remained attached to the base of the skull. A patch of brown, silvering hair, which, after 439 years underground, was still matted into hard, dark clumps by dried blood. You see, 15th century medicine was ignorant, but human logic is timeless. No sadness, no depression, no melancholia in the history of the world causes your skull to spontaneously cave in and your blood to glue your hair to your head. The Yorkist lie became the most pathetic joke in history. Died of sorrow? That sorrow must have taken the form of a steel warhammer swung with full force into the back of his neck. Based on these fractures, forensic experts have reconstructed the final moments. Picture that dark cell again. Henry VI is kneeling on the cold stone floor. His back is to the door. His thin hands are clasped in prayer, the only anchor left in his terrified, fragmented mind. The heavy oak door creaks open. Assassins, sent by Edward IV, slip inside. They don't need to struggle with a frail old man. A shadow steps up behind him. He raises a heavy metal object, perhaps a mace or the pommel of a broadsword. No sentence is read, no chance to turn around. Just a sickening, muffled thud. A lethal, cold, calculated blow delivered to the crown of the praying king's head. Blood sprays staining his tattered robe. Henry's body collapses onto the floor without a groan. His life, a life imprisoned by the madness of his mind and the cruelty of men, was extinguished like a candle. That crack in the skull was the bloody signature of the crown, an eternal seal of betrayal. But the most tragic comedy of all? Before that skull was shattered by violence, the brain inside had experienced a resurrection far stranger and more terrifying than death itself. To understand that, we must go back 17 years to the day he suddenly woke up. Truth number 4. The Christmas Resurrection. A child in a giant's body. The winter of 1454. England was shivering under a bone-chilling frost and an atmosphere of total despair. Nearly 2 years had passed since King Henry VI fell into a waking death, frozen like a statue, silent, unmoving, unresponsive to the world. For all that time, he lay in the great royal bed, hollow and soulless. Outside that bedroom door, the nation was collapsing. Political factions were sharpening their teeth to tear the regency apart. In the corridors, servants were already stitching funeral shrouds. The finest physicians stood by, hands folded in helplessness. Everyone, from the queen to the poorest peasant, believed the king was merely counting the days until the reaper claimed him. Then, on Christmas Eve, as the church bells began to peal for the birth of the Christ child, an impossible event occurred. In the candlelit chamber, a maid was changing the wet compress on the king's forehead when she clumsily dropped a brass basin. The clatter, clang, ripped through the silence. That sound seemingly shattered an invisible seal holding the king's brain captive. Henry VI, the man who had been a vegetable for 18 months, suddenly blinked. He slowly turned his head, his eyes widening at the terrified maid. Then he braced his hands against the mattress and sat up. The palace erupted. Shouts of, "The king is awake! A Christmas miracle!" echoed through the halls. Queen Margaret rushed in, her heavy silk skirts trailing behind her, followed by courtiers who couldn't believe their eyes. But as they surrounded the bed, their joy froze into a chill that ran down their spines. Henry VI looked at them and offered an incredibly innocent smile. This was not the sharp, authoritative gaze of a monarch. It was the clear, bewildered gaze of a 5-year-old child. He spoke in a thin, cheerful voice, waving them closer to tell them about a beautiful dream. He whispered that for the past 2 years, he hadn't been sick at all. He had been carried to heaven by angels with snow-white wings. The angels had sung him magnificent hymns and healed the sorrow in his body with their own hands. Though he declared himself born again, pure and without sin. The courtiers exchanged glances, cold sweat beading on their brows. The horrific truth crushed their hopes. The king had returned, his body was functional, but his intellect had been permanently incinerated by schizophrenia. The 18-month silence had eroded his capacity for complex thought. He had become a simpleton in a king's body. He would forgive enemies who had tried to kill him the day before. He would giggle and sign any decree placed before him, no matter how disastrous for the state. He refused his royal robes, demanding the coarse wool of a monk, and spent his days praying to birds. In a peasant family, a father turning into a holy fool is a quiet tragedy. In the 15th century English power vacuum, what a child king was a match thrown into a powder keg. Queen Margaret, a woman of steel and ambition, most learned doctor in 15th century England. You are summoned to the palace, crossing torchlit halls to face the most powerful man in the kingdom. But he isn't commanding you. He is catatonic. Eyes wide and unblinking, not eating, not speaking. In the 21st century, we would use antipsychotics, IV fluids, and intensive therapy. In 1454, welcome to the medical comedy of horrors. Medical knowledge was then dominated by the theory of the 4 humors. The royal physicians, old men in expensive silk robes, held a consultation and reached a staggering conclusion. The reason the king is frozen is that his bowels are clogged with black bile. This poison is releasing bad vapors that are steaming his brain into madness. And the official, royal-stamped treatment? Historian Carol Rawcliffe unearthed these records in her 1999 study, The Insanity of Henry VI. When you read them, you won't know whether to laugh at the absurdity or weep for the man. Step 1. The Great Enema. The physicians believed they had to clear the back door to clear the mind. In every day, brawny servants had to flip the king's rigid, immobile body over. The royal doctors used massive, cold, crude brass syringes to pump bizarre mixtures of bitter herbs, salt water, and sometimes animal fat directly into his rectum. They did this daily, hoping it would flush the melancholy out through his digestive tract. If the king could have spoken, he surely would have ordered their heads on pikes. Step 2. Scalp blistering. The logic was simple. The king was mad because his brain was too hot, like a pressure cooker about to explode. The solution? They pinned him down and shaved his royal head bald with a straight razor. Then they applied caustic ointments made of crushed mustard seeds, pepper, and mild acids, rubbing them into his bare scalp until it blistered and bled. They hoped the madness vapors would evaporate through the sores. In reality, Henry's head just became a pained, suppurating mess of infections. Step 3. Sensory shock. Since Henry was immune to words, they attacked his nose. They dunked him in wooden vats filled with water infused with the most pungent, nauseating herbs in the kingdom. They burned bundles of rotting roots and mugwort, creating a thick, stinging black smoke, and waved it directly into his face and nostrils. The royal bedroom became a literal smokehouse, so foul even the flies wouldn't enter. Put yourself in Henry's place. Your consciousness is trapped deep within the dark void of schizophrenia. Your body is paralyzed. And while you are fighting your own hallucinations, the best doctors in England are pumping water into your bowels, rubbing acid on your head, and blowing smoke into your eyes. That isn't medicine. That is demonic torture under a medical veil. The result of this expensive, gruesome treatment? Absolute zero. Schizophrenia, a psychological ghost humanity wouldn't name for another 400 years, laughed at 15th century science. Henry remained a statue, bruised and blistered by his own healers. But the most haunting part of this illness wasn't the physical pain. It was the moment his silence killed the heart of a father, on the most sacred day of his life. Truth number 6. The Silent Father. The Tragedy of Prince Edward. August 1453. At the Clarendon Palace, the air was heavy with the heat of late summer. Devastating news arrived from across the English Channel. The English army had been annihilated at the Battle of Castillon. Bordeaux, the last jewel of the English crown in France, had fallen. The 100 Years' War was over, ending in a humiliating defeat for England. When this news was read to Henry VI, he didn't scream. He didn't flip the table. According to witnesses, his eyes simply went dead. Like a candle blown out by a violent gust, Henry VI's mind shut down. Catatonic schizophrenia triggered an extreme defense mechanism, slamming every door of consciousness to protect the brain from a reality too cruel to bear. From that moment, he entered the waking death. He wasn't in a coma. His eyes were open, but his gaze was vacant, looking through people as if he were staring into an infinite abyss. History records heartbreaking details. He would not speak. Even as lords shouted war reports and the Queen wept at his feet, he was silent. When he needed to move, brawny servants had to lift him under the armpits and drag his royal legs across the carpet like a sack of grain. At mealtimes, physicians had to pry his clenched teeth open and pour thin soup down his throat, stroking his neck to force him to swallow. The peak of this horror came in October 1453, 2 months after he turned to stone. Queen Margaret of Anjou gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Prince Edward. In a feudal society, an heir was everything. It was the miracle that could save a crumbling nation. The lords believed that the magic of fatherhood, the cry of his own flesh and blood, would be the only weapon strong enough to break the king's mental cage. They staged a presentation in the royal bedroom, which still stank of herbal smoke. The newborn, wrapped in gold-threaded silks, was brought to the edge of the king's bed. The room was deathly quiet, save for the infant's cries echoing off the stone walls. The Duke of Buckingham lifted the child before the flesh statue, leaning against the pillows. His voice trembled. "Your Majesty, look, this is your son. Your little prince is born." Everyone held their breath. Sweat poured down the courtiers' faces, and then a tiny movement. Henry VI's dead eyes slowly slid to the side. He stared at the red-faced, crying infant. He looked for 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he slowly dropped his head. No word, no smile, no tear, no reaching out to touch his own blood. His silence was sharper and colder than any sword. A letter from John Stodeley, a royal messenger, recorded this chilling moment. When the lords brought the prince to the king, yet there was no answer, no sign. He looked once, and then cast down his head. Think about the truth behind that bowed head. Was Henry VI's mind truly gone? Or was it something worse? Did he hear his son's cry? Did he know it was his child? But was he so locked in the iron cage of catatonia that his muscles refused to move and his vocal cords refused to vibrate? The greatest joy of a king's life couldn't create a single ripple in that stagnant soul. This void of power allowed the scepter to fall into the hands of his enemy, Richard of York. One baby's cry and one father's silence signed the death warrant for thousands of Englishmen. But why did he break? Why did a 32-year-old man shatter so easily? And the answer lies in a dark curse planted in his genes decades earlier: the mad blood of France. Truth number 7. The French curse, a genetic death sentence. To find the source of the tragedy that led to the Tower of London and the near canonization, we must peel back the final layer of history: biological determinism. Leave the fog of England and cross to the opulent, conspiracy-laden courts of France. Centuries of royal political marriages had a high price. Henry V, the great warrior king, had married the beautiful Catherine of Valois, but Catherine brought a lethal dowry hidden in her DNA. She was the daughter of King Charles VI of France, known to history by a terrifying name: Charles the Mad. The madness of the French royals was no legend. In 1392, Charles VI suddenly drew his sword and slaughtered his own loyal guards because of a hallucination. His mind slid into a bottomless pit. At his lowest, he suffered from glass delusion. He screamed at his family to stay away, fearing he would shatter into pieces. He refused to wash for months, fearing the water would crack his glass body. He even had royal blacksmiths sew iron rods into his silk robes to act as a protective frame against the air. Decades later, that flawed gene flowed through the blood and into his grandson, Henry VI. Henry VI never had a childhood. He was crowned at 9 months old. While other babies were nursing, he was draped in heavy robes and forced to carry the weight of millions and a 100-year war. Modern psychiatry, looking through the lens of history, has delivered an undeniable verdict. Henry VI inherited catatonic schizophrenia compounded by major depressive disorder. The difference was in the manifestation. If the grandfather, Charles VI, went mad with screaming and violence, the grandson, Henry VI, went mad by retreating into himself. Catatonia cut the power to his consciousness, making him a prisoner in his own heaving chest. In the 15th century, there were no psychologists. There were only desperate prayers, exorcisms, and the cruelty of enemas and shaved heads. His madness wasn't understood. It was used. Looking at this bloody tapestry, the tragedy of Henry VI is monumental. He wasn't a tyrant. He was a gentleman who loved peace and scripture. He was born to be a monk, but fate forced a sword into his hand and told him to rule 2 bloodthirsty nations. The pressure of the crown acted as the catalyst, detonating the genetic bomb in his DNA. The result? He lost his mind, was tortured by ignorant doctors, was used as a political shield by his wife, and was eventually assassinated in a filthy cell. History closed the loop by having the poor and the mad worship the most miserable man on earth as their patron saint. The story of Henry VI remains a chilling reminder of the thin line between absolute power and the imprisonment of the mind, between the golden throne and the cruelty of genetic fate. History is indeed strange and ruthless, isn't it? The victors write the histories to hide their crimes, while the broken, mad losers write legends of miracles in the hearts of the suffering. What do you think of this poor king's life? Was his fall a result of his DNA, his incompetence? Or was he just a victim of a bloodthirsty era? Were those 174 miracles real, or just the psychological placebo of a desperate society? And would you ever dare try the enema and mustard treatment? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading and discussing them with you. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit like, share it with your fellow history buffs. And most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so we can continue uncovering the most gruesome secrets the textbooks never dared to teach you.